Hi, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating set of arguments about what are called the Quran's unseen miracles. Now, these aren't claims about science. Instead, they're all about knowledge of the distant past and the far future. We're just going to neutrally lay out the evidence and the logic as it's presented in our source material.
Okay, so let's jump right into the central puzzle that really kicks this whole thing off. The Quran has these incredibly detailed stories that you can also find in scriptures that are way older. But here's the twist. The person they're attributed to, Prophet Muhammad, was reportedly illiterate, and he was living in 7th century Mecca, where these ancient texts just weren't translated into Arabic. So how in the world is that possible?
All right, so the first argument that's put forward is this idea of correcting, not copying. The key here, proponents say, isn't that the stories are similar, it's that they are different in some very specific and very important ways. The perspective here is that the Quran isn't just repeating these older stories, it's actively refining them and correcting what are seen as theological problems inside them. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's take the story of Adam and Eve. On one side, you've got the Torah's account, where proponents of this view point out that, weirdly, the serpent kinda tells the truth, which makes God seem misleading. But then you look over at the Quran's account, and that whole issue is gone. Satan is just an outright liar. It also shifts the blame from being primarily on Eve to being a shared responsibility between both Adam and Eve. And a huge one. The Quranic version introduces the idea of repentance and God's forgiveness, something that's just not there in the other narrative.
And this quote just perfectly sums up the core of the argument. It's not about copying. It's about, well, purification. The thinking here is, look, if someone were just plagiarizing, they'd copy everything, right? The good, the bad, the so-called errors, all of it. But this perspective argues that the text shows this unique awareness by specifically fixing these theological snags.
Okay, so that's one part of the argument. But it builds from there. The next piece of the puzzle is what's called the implausible library. This moves beyond just the content of the stories and asks a very practical question. How could one person in 7th century Arabia even get their hands on this information in the first place? I mean, just look at this list. To piece together the stories as they appear in the Quran, it's argued that you'd need this massive library. And we're not just talking about the mainstream stuff like the Old and New Testaments. We're talking obscure, non-canonical texts, unofficial scriptures, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, or super complex Jewish legal texts from the Talmud, the whole shebang. But wait, it gets even more complicated. This huge collection of source material wasn't neatly organized in one language. No way. These texts were written in something like 8 to 10 different ancient languages. We're talking ancient Hebrew, Syriac, Coptic, Old Slavonic, ancient Greek, you name it. And here is the absolute kicker, the linchpin of this whole part of the argument. Not only was this library massive and written in a ton of different languages, but at the time, none of it is known to have been translated into Arabic. So you can see how this argument frames the situation as a nearly insurmountable barrier. How do you synthesize information you can't access and can't read? All right, so we've talked about knowledge of the past. Now, the argument completely pivots to the future. And the main example used here is a prophecy made right in the middle of a massive war between the two superpowers of the day, the Byzantine and the Persian empires. Let's just paint a picture of what was happening here. For almost 20 years, the Byzantines were on the ropes. I mean, they were getting completely hammered. The Persians had taken everything, Syria, Egypt, you name it, and were literally at the gates of the capital, Constantinople. It was so bad, the emperor was supposedly trying to flee. And it's at that absolute lowest point, that rock bottom, that the Quran makes a prediction. The Byzantines would turn it all around and win within 3 to 9 years.
And it's not just proponents of this view who say this was a long shot. They often point to famous Western historians like Edward Gibbon to drive the point home. The consensus at the time was that the Byzantine Empire was done for, finished. The idea that this broke, demoralized, and battered empire could possibly mount a comeback against the triumphant Persians in under a decade was, frankly, just unthinkable from any strategic point of view.
Okay, for our last piece here, we're looking at something really interesting. Turning what looked like total, humiliating defeats into victories that were supposedly called out from the very beginning, long before anyone could see the outcome. Take the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The situation was just awful for the early Muslims. They were stopped from their pilgrimage, and the treaty they had to sign seemed like a complete surrender. The sources say the Prophet's companions were furious. And then right in that moment of despair,
A verse from the Quran comes down calling it an obvious victory. Can you imagine? But the argument is that this defeat led to a 10-year truce, which allowed Islam to spread like wildfire, leading directly to the peaceful takeover of Mecca just a couple of years later. And this same pattern is argued to have happened on a much more personal level. After Prophet Muhammad's infant son passed away, his enemies in Mecca started taunting him. They called him Ebter, which means cut off. It was a deep, personal insult, basically saying, "You have no sons, your message will die with you, you're a dead end, your legacy is over." And the Quran's response? It just flips the whole thing right on its head. It revealed a short chapter that said, no, it's not the prophet who is cut off, it's his enemies. Their legacy is the one that's going to be cut off from history. So let's fast forward to today. What happened? Well, this slide shows the claimed result. While it's true the prophet's male lineage ended, his lineage through his daughter, Fatima, is now traced by millions of people all over the world. They proudly call themselves his descendants. But what about his chief enemies, who had plenty of sons at the time? The argument is that their powerful family lines have just vanished, faded into obscurity. So, to wrap this all up, the case presented here is built on these three interconnected pillars. First, the claim of correcting the theological errors in ancient scriptures. Second, the logistical nightmare of the impossible library. And third, the prediction of really improbable future events. It leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If this was all laid out as evidence in a case, what would your verdict